We are wrapping up this series we've been calling Relational Vampires. And I'll be honest, that's a really weird thing to name a series. So if you haven't been here, that might sound really weird to you. But kind of like the idea behind it was like, what do vampires do, right? They suck your blood. What do relational vampires do? They suck the life out of you. And you guys, even as I say that, you're like, you already got people who are coming to your mind, right? And we want this to be something that we kind of, through this series, like Jesus talks about loving others a lot. But sometimes when we hear that, it can kind of feel like really like ethereal, kind of like big. And like we want to kind of bring it super practical to like where it kind of meets us where we are at. Because the truth is, and I don't have to say this, I think we already know this, that some people are just harder for us to love than others, right? And we've been talking about specific types of people through this series. We talked about controlling people. We've talked about critical people. We've talked about needy people. And this last one, I get the honor of talking about hypocritical people. Right? Oh, yeah, I can even hear it right now. Everyone's like, oh, yeah, that's where we're going, right? So real quick, I need a little bit of audience participation in this, just to make sure we're all on the same page. Real quick, show of hands, how many of you know a hypocrite? Right? Yes, almost everyone. All right, go ahead, put your hands down. Put your hands back up if that person is sitting next to you. Don't do it. It's going to be awkward. That's a trick. Don't fall for that. All right. But like what we are doing, and hopefully through this morning, is learning how to relate to and ultimately love a hypocrite, because it's a really big deal. Because unfortunately, hypocrisy is kind of just part of our American culture and also just the culture of church, even from the very beginning of people trying to act like they maybe have things together when they don't really. There's this study they've done the last couple of years about this group called the Barna Group, and we're going to throw that up there. I know it might be a little hard for some of you to read, but I'll point out the things that are important. But basically, they asked the question, what causes people to doubt Christianity? And they asked people who were Jesus followers, they asked people of other faiths and religions, and they also asked people who had said they had no faith. And what I think is so interesting is if on that very first row, for people who were Jesus followers, that's number 2. For something that makes them doubt their faith. 22% of people said hypocrisy of religious people makes them doubt their faith. And that might, like, to be honest, is only 1% lower than human suffering, right? Like, that is a really big deal. And to be honest, like, I totally relate to that. Like, every time I feel like I have, like, a pastor or someone that I know that I hear about some sort of moral failing or some sort of thing that happens in their life, there is something about me that's like, man, what are we doing? Is this whole thing crazy? Like, what? It kind of helps me, it makes me pause and doubt in those moments. And then for both other people of other faith and people of no faith, that's literally the number one thing on their list. It says 26% for people of other faith, and 42% of people who have no faith say the hypocrisy of religious people is what causes them to doubt Christianity. And there's this quote, you may have heard this before, from this author and speaker, Brennan Manning, and this is what he says, I think goes right along with this. The greatest single cause of atheism in the world today is Christians who acknowledge Jesus with their lips and walk out the doors and deny him by their lifestyle. That is what an unbelieving world simply finds unbelievable. And so when it comes to hypocrisy, when it comes to hypocrites, right, the stakes are so high because we have this world that needs Jesus. And so often hypocrisy, being hypocrites, kind of is like this wall that blocks other people from really getting to experience Jesus. So for us, we need to learn how to love hypocritical people. And on the other side, we also need to learn how to avoid becoming one ourselves. And this is just like a little side note for some of you, like maybe some of you here and you're like, you know what, I'm not a Jesus follower. I just showed up here because my significant other or like someone in my family made me show up here, or like your parents or whatever. I totally get it. I was there for a long time. I get that. But just so you know, like this is kind of like one of those messages. It's kind of like a family meeting. We're specifically talking about Christians, helping other Christians who are hypocritical. If you're here, like none of this, and if you're not a Jesus follower, this doesn't apply to you. I'm giving you already like your get out of jail free card. You can hopefully still enjoy this and maybe glean some things from it, but none of this is binding to you. So hope you have a great message. But for the rest of us in this room who would say that we're Jesus followers, what I want to do is I want to build a foundation for where I want to go today. And kind of want to start by just defining what hypocrisy is so we're all on the same page. So first, let's talk about what it's not. Hypocrisy is not the difference between what we do and what we wish we did, right? And if you're anything like me, I have so many things that I could put on this list, right? It's not like if maybe you're here specifically because we're in church, maybe you're like, you know what? I really want to read my Bible more. I want to pray more. There's something that maybe has even been in your, like you've wanted to do that for years and you've never quite done anything about it. Or maybe it's like that thing where you're like, man, I wish I went to the gym more. And then you've been saying it over and over and over, and now we're like, I don't know, middle of the year almost, and you're still like haven't actually fulfilled that goal for your New Year's resolutions, right? Or maybe it's that thing that you keep messing up, and you keep saying, I'm going to get better at this, and you just haven't done it yet. Like those things, that's not hypocrisy. Some of those things might be things you feel really guilty about. Some of those things might even be sin. But a lot of times that's just us not kind of living up to our own standards. But that's not hypocrisy. So when you see your dentist this year and you still haven't started flossing, guess what? You're not a hypocrite. You're not good at flossing. I get you. I'm with you, right? No, what we want to say, hypocrisy is the gap between what we show and who we are. Right? It's this difference between what we say and how we live. It's this gap between like our public persona of who we want everyone else to see us as versus like our private character of who we are when no one else is looking or maybe just a few people are there. And this is, again, really important for us to get because Jesus, I think when he talks about hypocrisy, like, and you can call me out on this. We can talk about it afterwards. I don't think there's a point through the Bible where we see Jesus getting more mad about something than hypocrisy, than people who are like religious and they're like living one way and they're acting another way. Like this is something that comes up constantly. And when he talks about it, he actually uses this Greek term, hypocrites, which actually in the Greek would have just meant an actor. Like a stage player, someone who was like, you know, an actor on a stage. And they used to, during this time, would have like these masks that they would hold to kind of like, you know, hide behind during different things. Yeah, those things are horrifying for the record. That's some of the pictures of the ones that would have been used during Jesus' time. And you thought like the Hope doll was a little scary? They ain't got nothing on these masks, right? But yeah, so it's like the actor would use that as they're playing each different character. And if you've been around church long enough, like you have seen this played out, right? Maybe it's that person who like puts on this mask of like everyone should have these really high moral standards. But then if you look at their own life, like they're constantly breaking them, but they're like really judgy when other people aren't doing that. Or maybe it's that person who has like this mask of everything's going great, right? Everything is awesome. Everything is going great in my life. There's no problems. But really, if they actually shared what was going on, like their life is falling apart and they don't know what to do next. And they're filled with doubt and questions and all these things. And they actually feel like completely the opposite of that. But they would never let you in on that. Or one thing I feel like I've heard so often is like that person who's like the boss of a company and like they talk really spiritual and they talk about Jesus a lot, but then if you look and they maybe even say like I have a Christian company, right? And then as soon as you actually look at the way that they treat their employees, like they're really unkind, they don't have any integrity, they're always trying to break rules and find ways out. And for the record, this is not me, like not a veiled attempt for me to talk about Joel here, even though he is my boss. That is 100% just like a thing that I feel like I've heard and I've experienced so many times. But again, not Joel, not calling out Joel. But Jesus, again, had no tolerance for hypocrisy. In fact, if we look at Matthew's gospel, this is kind of like one of the stories of Jesus' life. There's this section called the 7 Woes where he's talking to these Pharisees, these religious leaders at the time. And he basically is calling them out. And he says over and over like, woe to the hypocrites. And then he'll say something they're doing wrong. Woe to the hypocrites. He'll say something going wrong. And then I think he kind of summarizes it with one of these last verses in it. It's Matthew 23:28. He says, outwardly, you look like righteous people, but inwardly your hearts are filled with hypocrisy and lawlessness. He says the way that you are living isn't actually what you're projecting to other people. So for us, like, what is our role in a situation like this, right? Or do we have a role? Do we just kind of sit back and like prayer and like going like, God, please like change this person's heart. They're being a hypocrite, right? How do we respond when we see people who are being hypocritical? Like, what do we do? How do we love these people who proclaim one thing, but inwardly they're living a different life? And to know how to love a hypocrite, I think it helps to kind of have this understanding of the way that why they're acting the way that they are. And I want to kind of go through three different groups of people. And I think, to be honest, these first two groups that sometimes we can kind of lump into hypocrites, and I don't really think they're hypocrites, but sometimes we can say that they are. I think the first one is that maybe they don't actually follow Jesus. There are, a lot of people, even on this Sunday, like I'm sure they're here, and like, again, you don't really follow Jesus. You're just here because someone has made you. You're here because you have to, or maybe you're here because, it kind of makes me feel good, right? But like maybe for those people, like they don't actually have like the life change that happens because of Jesus. They haven't been made new. They don't actually have that relationship with Jesus. I know, at least for me, growing up, like my mom would make us go to church, and I did not want to go, and almost any single time. But like in middle school and high school, especially, like if you would have said, like, "Hey, are you a Christian?" I would have said yes, because for me, being a Christian was that on Sunday mornings you had an appointment, right? You had to be at church, right? That was for me all it was. And when I had made decisions through the week, it wasn't one time thinking about like, all right, what would Jesus think about this? It was instead just like, what would I do about this? So when I didn't live up to what Jesus' standards were, I wasn't being a hypocrite. I just didn't actually follow Jesus. I didn't care about that. But I think sometimes we can lump them in as hypocrites. Second thing is maybe they just don't know better yet, right? I think oftentimes, especially when people first start following Jesus, sometimes we expect them to like act like someone who's been following Jesus for 40 years, to have everything put together, right? And there is something, just like everything else, that we slowly grow in our faith. It doesn't just happen overnight. You don't just start following Jesus and you're like, bam, this is perfect. I'm reading my Bible for 30 hours a day. I'm praying all the time, right? Like, no, that's not how life works. It takes time. It's this process. So there's kind of something to like new Christians as they're kind of going through this process to give them time to grow. And in those moments, these are people that don't need correcting. Instead, they kind of just need instructing. Maybe someone just hasn't told them any different yet. I remember years ago, I heard this pastor talk about this kid who showed up to their kids' ministry on a Sunday morning. And like their family was going through stuff. They didn't normally go to church, but they were like, you know what, we're going to try this. We're going to give it a go. And they showed up, and like they said from the beginning, you could tell like the kid did not want to go back into their kids' ministry. But then he went anyways, and then came out, and like you could tell like it was a great experience. So they said, hey, how did it go? And the kid just screams out, man, this place is flipping awesome, right? Except he did not say flipping in that moment, right? Like 100% just yells it out. And in that moment, it would have been really easy to go like, hey, this is not the place to be yelling that out. This is not the place to be screaming that, right? And like kind of like really kind of like condemning or like correcting that kid. But really, that kid just didn't know any better, right? He just was so excited, and that was the best way that he had it. So maybe on the other side, it's more of like, hey, maybe let's use different words next time, buddy. Maybe let's actually say flipping. Like let's just do something else. Or I remember my senior year of high school, I had this buddy who had just started following Jesus. Maybe for like a couple of months, and it was a Sunday night, and like our youth pastor was about to get up on stage and start teaching, and he kind of looks over at me and he goes, man, are we not doing snack time today? And I remember thinking, like, what? Are you talking about snack time? He goes, yeah, normally they pass around like those shots of like grape juice, and then we have that really good bread because we use the sweet Hawaiian bread. And like in that moment, it would have been really easy for me to go like, what is wrong with you? Don't talk about communion that way, right? But really, he was talking about someone he just didn't understand yet. He literally thought this was just a fun snack time that we had in the middle of things, right? He didn't understand. He just needed some instructing, not correcting. But what I really want to focus on today is this last group of people. The people you probably normally are thinking of when it comes to hypocrites, is that maybe they know better, but they still disobey the way of Jesus. Right? These are the people that like think they're above the rules, that rationalize their stuff. They justify what's going on in their lives. Maybe this is that person that you know that's like addicted to porn. But for them, they're like, it's not hurting anybody else. Why does it matter? It's a secret between me and the screen. There's just me and that screen, and no one else has to get hurt by it. Maybe it's that person that you know that would say like, oh, I'm not materialistic. I just really like nice things, right? Like it's like those things that we can really easily justify and excuse in our lives. So today what I really want to do is I want to talk about this third group. Not the people that don't necessarily know better and that just maybe need some instructing, but people who do know better and they still choose the opposite. And I think through the Bible, we see through like the prophets, kind of God's speaking pieces through people, through the Old Testament, and through Peter and Paul in the New Testament as they're leading the early church, and through Jesus, we kind of see like a similar way that they confront hypocrisy. And I think it's a way that if we did this, it would change so many conversations. It would change the way that we talk to people about this kind of stuff. So I want to talk about having like a loving confrontation with a hypocrite. So the first thing is when you're trying to have a loving confrontation with a hypocrite is confront with the goal of restoration. Confront with the goal of restoration. Because so often when we are trying to confront somebody about something going on in their life, we can kind of go in there with like our weird, sick, twisted version of what justice means, right? We go in there, and I've been guilty of this so many times, where we go in there like, I want to punish this person, right? I want to get back at this person. I want to kind of get back at that person they hurt, right? I want you to feel like the pain that I'm feeling. We have like this weird version of justice where we are trying to kind of put them in their place. But that's not the kind of justice that we see throughout the Bible. What we see is God has this justice that's more restorative. It's like helping bring people back into relationship. Not just going, hey, we're just done with you. No, he calls them to something else, calls them to something more. Yes, there are things that need to change, but he calls them to bigger and better things. He calls them to restoration instead of just kind of sending them off on their own. Paul, when he's writing to the church of Galatia, he says it like this, which I think helps us kind of as we're talking about this. Brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently, right? Like taking that time to be like, I'm not just going to come in like guns blazing. I'm going to come in and have an honest conversation in a very kind way with you. It's that difference between restorative and just like a punishment. Another translation says it like this that I think, at least for me, is really helpful. Says, dear brothers and sisters, if another believer is overcome by some sin, you who are godly should gently and humbly help that person back onto the right path. I like that because it kind of gives you like, instead of going in there as the judge, you're trying to get them right on the right path, right? You're almost more like, instead of the judge, you're more like a guide, trying to help them, trying to point them back to the right thing and not just going, hey, you've been wrong all these different ways. No, it's like, I'm going to kind of guide you back. Because when we are trying to confront somebody with the goal of restoration, and this, I'm going to say something and you're not going to like, your goal is not to be right. Can I just say that? I know I don't like that. I don't like hearing myself say it, to be honest. But can I just say it one time? Your goal isn't to be right. Your goal is to help someone else be right with God. And sometimes that means you can't just go in there going, hey, these are all the things you're right. You might be right and just say it in the wrong way, and it makes it so it actually pushes them farther away. Your goal instead is to like whatever means you need to help guide them back to the right place. Even if you have to act like I don't know the right answers, right? Even if you don't have to act like you were righteous and know the right things. There's like this balance of truth and grace in these moments. We see Jesus constantly does this. There's this story of Jesus and this woman who was caught in adultery, right? She got caught in adultery, and all these religious leaders basically find her and like bring her to Jesus, and like I want to make like this big spectacle. They're like, they already have rocks in their hands. They're like, hey, she committed adultery. That means the law says we should stone her. Like we're going to throw these rocks at her until she dies, right? We are going to end her because of this sin. And what I love is in that moment, Jesus says, all right, anyone who doesn't have sin, go ahead and throw the first rock. And then in that moment, does like maybe one of my favorite Jesus moves is he just kind of stoops down and starts just drawing in the dirt. And like the Bible talks about how like the men kind of slowly like drop their rocks and they're walking away. And we don't know what he's writing on the ground. There's all kinds of theories about what maybe Jesus was writing. Some people think like he was just kind of doodling. Just like, I'm going to give you a minute. Go ahead. You're going to figure this out that none of you are perfect. Go ahead. Take a minute. I'm over here draw like, I don't know, a sun. So I always draw when I'm drawing on a piece of paper, right? Or right in the corner, it's got a smiley face. Maybe that's what Jesus is doing, right? Or maybe some of the theories are that maybe Jesus was writing basically like, love God, love the others. Like these phrases, these terms that they would have already known and understood, right? And some people think that maybe he was even bending down and just writing down the sins of each of those different people who are trying to condemn her, right? But all we know is all those people slowly walk away until it is just Jesus and this woman. And he says, do none of your accusers condemn you? He says, I don't either, right? He has so much grace for her in that moment. But he doesn't just end it with the grace. He tells her, all right, go and sin no more, right? Like he holds grace and truth together. And so often when we're confronting people, we want just one or the other, and we don't hold them so well together. So we want to confront with the goal of restoration. And then we also want to confront carefully. We confront because we care, but we have to do so humbly. Check out the rest of Galatians 6:1. I was hiding part of the verse from you. Now you finally get to have the full thing, right? And be careful not to fall into the same temptation yourself. So often when we're confronting someone about something that we know is wrong in their life, man, we are so vulnerable to pride, right? Because there is something about self-righteousness that feels real good. And like something where we can look at somebody and go, hey, I can fix you. Like I know something that you don't. So we have to be so careful that we don't just fall into like being really prideful and going, oh, I have all the answers for you. Especially in like this current thing that we're in, like this cancel culture where we can be like, oh yeah, I'm so much better than you. We're just going to cancel you. We're going to send you off. That's not restorative, right? Instead, finding ways like how can we mend some of these relationships? What do we need to change to make it so that we can both thrive, we can both survive? So how do we confront carefully with the heart to restore? Well, I think Jesus actually lays this out for us really simply, and probably some of his most practical teaching that we've ever seen from Jesus. I know sometimes he says things that are like, what is Jesus talking about, right? And like it has like a deeper meaning. Some of his most practical teaching, what I'm about to share with you, I'm going to kind of give you the cliff notes for it. And let me just tell you, I think this is also some of his most ignored teaching because we just don't want to do it, right? But if we just followed some of these steps that Jesus talks about with handling conflict, whether it's with hypocritical people or anyone in general, man, it would completely change your relationships. It would change like the cultures around you. I think this would be life-changing for us. So Jesus is basically sharing how to kind of handle conflict. And he says, if your brother or sister has sinned against you. So pause before we keep going. Like this is specifically about Jesus followers confronting other Jesus followers, right? This isn't about like, hey, ask non-Christians to, live up to standards that they don't actually believe in, right? This isn't like a permission to go out and be the moral police for everyone else, right? No, this is Jesus saying, hey, like a brother or sister, another Jesus follower, if they're doing something, like this is how you handle it. If you guys have a sin issue, right? He says, between you, so again, this is an intimate relationship. You know each other. It implies a relationship. He says, if you guys have an issue, go to them one-on-one. And all of us are like, that's not impressive. But how often do we actually do that, right? When you have an issue with somebody, more often, sometimes it's like a social media post. Sometimes it's we go and like start telling and griping to other people about it. And sometimes it would be like you're 8, 9 people, like later you're still griping about it. And that person finally goes, hey, have you actually just talked to this person about it? And you're like, oh man, I haven't. That's brilliant, right? But no, Jesus says like, that's just start there. Don't waste all that time of just complaining to other people. Just go to that person one-on-one and have that conversation. And he says, if they listen, guess what? You've won them over and the whole thing's over. And if not, he says, next, bring support. He says, go to them first and then just bring support. Bring 2 or 3 other people with you. Maybe people who care about them, some family members, someone else that is maybe going to help them see how they have hurt you, how things have gone wrong. And then he says, if that doesn't work, take it to the church, right? Take it to like the church leadership and say like, hey, there's a bigger issue here. We've tried to solve this. It's not working out. Do that. And then he says the last one, he says, treat them like a tax collector. And that one sounds really weird in our context because I don't know about you. Like I don't love paying taxes, but I don't have like any weird animosity towards any tax collectors, right? Maybe you do. Maybe you get this more. But like kind of like the bigger idea that he was getting at is like maybe redefine the relationship, right? Like maybe there's kind of, you need to set a boundary or change the way that you're going to interact with that person going forward to make it so you guys can both have a healthier relationship to kind of restore them back, right? So confront with the goal to restore, confront carefully. We have one more that I think is going to be everyone's favorite. It's this one. See when you're the hypocrite. Gotcha. Well, it's not everyone's favorite, right? This is actually everyone's least favorite. I don't even like saying it, right? See when you're the hypocrite. Because there is something about us that when it feels like if you were trying to find out where you're a hypocrite, it's like we're looking into a mirror blindfolded, right? We just can't see it. We can't see it in ourselves. There's this story we see in the Bible of King David, who is supposed to be a man after God's own heart, right? That is like his big thing that everyone talks about. Man, he's a man after God's own heart. He's a big deal, follows God, all the things. And then we hear this story, maybe you've heard it's kind of like the greatest hits of the Bible, where he commits adultery with this woman named Bathsheba. And they're having a kid, and to try to cover it up, he then takes her husband, his friend Uriah, and sends him to like the front lines of a war to basically make sure that he is killed, to try to cover up this thing that he did. So, layers and layers of sin. And then Nathan, this prophet, shows up to David and tells him this crazy story. He says, there is this rich man that is like, has so much cattle, has so much money, has all these things. And there's also this poor man. And he says, this poor man doesn't have any cattle. He literally has one animal. He has a little sheep. He does everything with his sheep, though. And he even talks about how, sleeps by his bed, is literally has seen his kids grow up. This guy does everything with this sheep, right? And then it says, one day a traveler shows up. And then when the traveler gets there, this rich man wants to celebrate, make a really big deal about this traveler. He's like, oh man, I'm going to give you the best meal. And instead of taking any of his cattle, goes straight to this poor man, takes his sheep and slaughters it for this man's meal. And you can imagine David, we can check this out in 2 Samuel 12, 5-7. This is David's reaction. David burned with anger against the man, right? And said to Nathan, as surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing and had no pity. And then Nathan said to David, you are the man. But he didn't say it like that because that sounds way too cool, right? He says, I always say you are that man sounds better, but you are the man, but not in the good way, right? You are the man. And when that happens, David was outraged by this hypothetical story, right? It didn't even happen, but he ignored his own hypocrisy in his heart. And the thing is, it's so easy to look at David and go, man, what a fool. We do this all the time. So often we can be like David. I think so often, wherever you are the most condemning is often a reflection of you. Often the things that we find the most fault in with other people are actually things that we're working on ourselves and we're trying to figure it out. Maybe for you, it's you're constantly nitpicking or complaining about how other people spend their money. And for you, it's because money has become an idol in your life and it's become the most important thing. Or maybe you feel really insecure with the money that you have, and so you complain about how other people are handling it. Maybe for you, it's there's this addiction that is festering inside of you, and instead of really dealing with it and really kind of doing something about it, you instead just point out all the weaknesses and all the different things in other people instead of really doing something about it. Or again, so often it can be that person that is so self-righteous, makes a big deal about what they're doing and complains about what everyone else is doing, when really maybe for them, they just really haven't experienced God's love and God's grace, and they really kind of feel does God really love me even when I mess up? And so because of that, they expect everyone else to hold up all these standards that they are not really living up to on their own. So for us, how do we figure this out for us? If we are so blind to our own hypocrisy, well, I think there's 2 things. And this first one, I'm going to be honest, is not fun homework. But I promise if you do it, it's going to make a difference in your life. And some of you might already be really good at this. But I know a lot of us, because of just American culture, we go. We don't ever take time to do this. Is just take some time for self-reflection. What if you just took a few minutes this week to just pause and think about your life, ways that maybe you're winning right now, things that are going really well in your life, and things that maybe you want to improve about your life, and just take that time. And some of you, again, I know you're really good at this. You're I'm already doing this anyways. But for some of us, we just keep going and going, and you're already thinking, you've already tuned out 5 minutes ago. You're already thinking about what you're doing for dinner, right, or for lunch, right? You're already moved on. Take some time for self-reflection. And if you're doing that, great. If not, add it in. But the one thing that's hopefully a backup, a fail-safe for all of us, and this is the reason why we talk about it all the time, is be in community. That's why we talk about table groups all the time here at Bridgeway. We think they are so important because there is something about the way that other people see you that sees things that you are missing. And maybe that's the table group. Maybe for you, that's a significant other. But I will say that I think sometimes, and I'm sure you have an amazing significant other, I do as well, but sometimes they can kind of give us the benefit of the doubt in some of those things that we're kind of short on. And so sometimes you can ask them, like, go ahead, ask your significant other, like, how are some ways that you're being a hypocrite? As a little side note, don't do that like right when you're going to bed. Like that is horrible time to bring it up. That's just causing for a fight, right? Like give it some time, maybe over a meal or something. But like ask them like, what are some ways that like I act like one way and then I really, say I'm like another way. Or like, maybe a spouse isn't the right person. Maybe some friends. Who are those people near you that are going to call you on your stuff? So for us, how do we love a hypocrite? We confront with the goal of restoring, of bringing them back into a relationship. We confront carefully, and we see when we are the hypocrite. Man, can you imagine how different the church would be, how different our world would be if we all did this? If instead of trying to like just be the judge for everyone else, what if we just took time to just guide other people lovingly? To go, hey, you're not perfect, I'm not perfect. Let's just try to figure this out together, to love each other in a way that leads back to life. Because ultimately, we aren't the ones that get to judge. We aren't the ones that fix things. Jesus is the one that fixes things.